Laird Benner and Bill Shaw, and it's May 29th, 2010. And I think the way to begin, Bill, is to sort of talk about the numbers of organizations and activities you've been involved in the Northern Sonoran Desert.
Well, I have a long connection and love of Mexico.
Okay.
I grew up in Southern California, and we spent almost every Thanksgiving and Easter holiday in Baja California. So I have very fond memories as a child there. But then when I got involved in academia and involved in natural resources, I did kind of make a conscious decision after 5 or so years that my efforts would be best spent working with students from developing countries, only because I felt I had more impact than more PhDs in ecology and natural resources working in the U.S. And for selfish reasons, because I like to go to these places. So I began to deliberately cultivate the international student, and not consciously working for Mexico, but it just was, the proximity was there, and the pool of potential, really smart and idealistic students was great. And so in the last 10 or so years, almost all of my students have been Latin Americans. So that's what got me down there, and most of them have worked in the upper Gulf of California in one capacity or another.
Now, how did you get to the U of A? And because you've got a kind of a dual hat that you've played at least ever since I've known you.
Well, I grew up in California, went to Berkeley for undergraduate in ecology, and then I knew I liked ecology, but I wanted to get the practical side, so I went to Utah State University for a degree in wildlife management. And I knew I liked that, but I realized that you couldn't be effective in conservation without getting more involved in the social political aspect, which drew me to the University of Michigan for my PhD, that had a strong natural resource school. And I graduated there in '74, and we just knew it had to be west, and this is where I landed. I've been here ever since.
Was that during Irv Zuby's time?
I came before Irv.
You came before Irv?
Yes, but he was a major mentor for me.
And did you come to the U of A first and then have the Park Service or that connection, or was that a joint appointment?
Well, I did have some. I didn't have a formal appointment with the Park Service. There was a period of time I was consulting because they had my dissertation was on public attitudes toward wildlife. I minored in sociology. And the Fish and Wildlife Service funds, they do this massive national survey every 5 years that they are mandated to do to give them the formula to distribute a lot of money from Pittman Robinson, Dingell Johnson, firearms excise tax money. And so they have to know who participates in what in each state. It's a complicated formula. So they run this big survey, and most of the data never gets used.
Right.
So I worked for a while with Fish and Wildlife Service, but with Park Service, nothing formal. During when Bill Palak, remember Bill? Yeah. When he was around, most of my research was at Saguaro National Park, so that's
probably why I'm
the
thinking
connection.
Yeah, because that's how Luther got connected to you.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Now.
And then our interests in the Western Sonoran Desert and
right.
Yeah.
So we put together with Bill Palak this fairly large study of impacts of development on the Saguaro National Park. So that was the story there.
Well, which leads me then to talk about the relationships you've had with non-governmental organizations, and there's quite a few of them. Is it called Southwest Parks and Monuments that you guys are in the board of, you and Bill Boyles and David?
It's now Western National
Western
Parks.
National Park. Okay, so we're talking about the Western National Parks and
So
SADL.
it started out as Southwest National Parks Association. Well, I have a big piece of what I've done, and that's one of the things I have liked about this university is the free reign, once you get tenured, to commit time and effort to nonprofits. So I thanks to Irv Zuby, really, who mentored me into several of those. So he got me involved in both the Desert Museum, the International Sonoran Desert Museum, and with what was then the Southwest National Parks Association. And literally in a classic mentor sense, he brought me into that and sat me down and said, this enriches my life because I remember it quite clearly. You meet a lot of non-academics and get to know people other than just be isolated in academia. And he was absolutely right. And so I've really, really enjoyed those nonprofits. And that actually does go back to
A long time.
Irv's mentoring.
Right. Right.
And then there've been a whole bunch of others. I don't know how far you want me to go.
No, please, we actually want you to go.
Oh, okay.
A list, please. That would be terrific.
So with Southwest National Parks, that has now become the Western National Parks Association. The Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum. I got involved with the Sonoran Institute through Luther.
And that was Rincon.
I guess it was Rincon
Yeah,
Institute. That's
yeah.
correct. And on that, I wasn't board. I was science advisor. And then I'm going to forget some. SADO, which has been an informal kind of science associate with them. And then most recently, the two that I'm actually chairman of two boards, and this is a great way to finish out a career. So one of them is called COBE, Comunidades de Biodiversidad, which is a nonprofit that was established by several of my former students. And this was maybe 15 years ago. And it was, I think, 4 or 6 idealistic young Mexican biologists that wanted to basically work with local fishermen, empower them with the goal being sustainable fisheries. And that grew to be a little bit bigger, and then finally, kind of like your project in Ajo, after about, I should know this, but I don't know it. I want to say 15 years, but 10 to 15 years, they were this small clique of Mexican ecologists, but functioning as a nonprofit, but they never quite got around to having an independent board. And so last year, they had a big meeting in Tucson and formalized all of this business, and I became chairman of that board. So now we're up and officially functioning, and they have maybe 6 professional level staff employees. These are PhDs. They're working in Mexico City, Yucatan, and throughout the Gulf of California. These people, and it's not just a spark, it's been up and running and growing steadily for the last 10 years. So,
where does it get its money?
Mainly from foundations, some from Mexican government, and quite possibly more and more through Fondo Mexicano or some of the Mexican government. So,
and their area of interest is waterways, preservation of biological diversity in waterways.
It's marine conservation in the broadest sense.
Has your own interest sort of gone toward the marine?
Well, it has been dragged
Yeah, I see.
And for the last 10 years, it's been entirely marine conservation.
That's what I thought, was sort of surprising.
That's not, I don't really have a publication, but, well, I do now, thanks to all the students. I'm co-author on a bunch, but that's not, I'm not known for that. I work in kind of the politics of conservation, basically.
But you have a large grant now?
Yes, I have two main funding sources now. One is Packard Foundation, which has been the primary source of all the work in the Gulf of California. And it's, we're now into about the 5th or 6th year. We collaborate through that with 1, 2, 3 Mexican nonprofits, plus 1 Mexican academic institution. So it's Kobe, Sado, Pronatura, Noroeste, and then CICESE, which is an academic program based in Ensenada, plus UC Santa Cruz.
Yeah, we talked to Francisco Sonoran, so
Oh,
got a
yeah.
good picture of the net fabric out there.
Yes.
Pretty extensive.
But the U of A is the nexus for this project we call PONGUS. And we're into the 3rd renewal of $1 million renewal. So
Describe Pongus a little bit for us, because while Peggy talked about it, she kept talking about it like I knew, and because I'm an academic, I never admit when I don't know anything.
yeah.
But I can to you.
PONGUS is the name, of course, refers to the small-scale fisheries and what we work, the boats they use. And that's our focus, is sustainable small-scale fisheries in the upper Gulf of California. Maybe we're growing beyond the upper half, but that's been the focus. And the work that we've been doing, the broad goal is conservation of biodiversity and sustainable management of fisheries. So we've had this really wonderful mix of all kinds of science. So we go to CICESE, and we have as one of our collaborators and major subcontractor for us to do the oceanographic work. So the biologists need to know what the currents will do with the larval stages of various organisms and things like this. So we have the preeminent really oceanographer for, at least for the Gulf of California, maybe for all of Mexico, as one of our PIs. And they do a bunch of modeling. And then we have the biologists that are out there. And the latest PhD, who's just finishing up now, is actually spending all his time working with the oceanographers to model where the larvae will end up and where the habitats are, and put the oceanography together with the biology. So we've got a variety of different biological things, and then collaborators like Sado are gathering fisheries harvest data, things like that. Then we've also just 2 PhDs have done really social science work. One focusing on a social network analysis methodology for looking at how fishermen get their information, who they relate to, again, the practical objective being, if you're the Mexican government and you have new regulations, how do you get the word out to them? Or who are the opinion makers? Who should you focus your efforts at? So, and probably, I'm sure you know, Jenny Duberstein, that's her dissertation. And then another student that did work that Helen would have directed, which is on the policy side of it, on the Sinti. Yeah. So it's kind of pretty amazing because it is truly interdisciplinary, and most of these scientists have never interacted like that, and because of the substantial funding we get from Packard, we've got a pretty nice carrot out there that says, we need to know what your oceanography tells us, but you got to sit down and talk to our biologists. So that part.
How is the interaction going with the fishermen?
Well,
because I know that when the Upper Gulf and Pinacate were designated, there was some initial backlash, and that's been
actually, it's one of the things that's most remarkable in my mind about this, and it's because of the usual. I mean, what we all know, but it never happens, is you don't just go out and interview and gather.
Mm-hmm.
But because we have Mexican collaborators, all of the students involved are bilingual. Not all Mexican, but Latin American, except for Jenny, and she's bilingual. Kobe, for example, our grants to Kobe and to Sado enable them to hire local people to gather some of the data for us, including local fishermen's sons and things like that. So Kobe has been really good. Several of the people that have been our data gatherers are fishermen or sons of fishermen, and some have gone on to get advanced degrees as a result of it. But I think that's the key. Is I mean, that, as you know, the northern Gulf of California is just hammered with idealistic master's and PhD students from all over the U.S. that want to go study there. And there's a real problem of interview fatigue and just, I don't know how to manage that, but it's a serious problem.
Yeah.
I mean, these people are sick of being asked the same questions over and over.
And nothing to show for it.
Yeah, so there's been a real effort to involve local people in that, and then we go back with workshops. And another one of our Mexican students, Marcia Moreno, is really good with GIS work. So they go back and do workshops with computers, mapping, showing where the fishermen said, collectively where they said this fishing activity occurs or doesn't occur, and where the reproductive areas are and whatever, as part of the local knowledge, and then they see it and they correct it. So they actually own it.
One of the things that we had explored with Laura Lopez Hoffman and Francisco was this notion of the networks in the border are so much more enhanced if in fact you've got students who have come up from Mexico, they've been sort of inculcated in US culture, they're bilingual, they've got training, then they go back down there often in positions of power and authority, and now it's sort of a love for their own place, but they're field trained. And you actually are the first person I've heard who has said strategically, that's what my goal in my life is, to do that. And can you speak a little bit more about how that's worked? And
as I mentioned earlier on, I made a conscious decision to work in developed countries as much as I could. And part of it was, as I said, very selfish. I just like to learn about and go to these places. So I had, I've got these gatherings of students all over the world. That's really been rewarding. And a cool thing you find out, I'm sure you know, Helen, is if a student's able to make it through their systems and get out of there, they're so good. They're smart, and they're like 5 years more mature than the same.
And they're hungry.
And they understand systems, barriers to social systems.
So
and they work so hard. So it's just been unbelievable. And they get their PhD, and then instead of joining a huge bureaucracy where they have that much impact, they go back and become director of parks and wildlife for their whole country.
Mm-hmm.
So I got involved with the students from wherever I just saw them trying to get in, and I was willing to pick them up And so I've had them from Kenya and Kuwait and Nepal, Colombia, and a few other places. But most of the funding comes through some kind of international donor program, which means that whether it's USAID or World Wildlife Funds or World Bank, they have a kind of political obligation to spread out that money. And as a consequence, you end up with all these bright students scattered around with no real network to hook into. And so they go to the University of Michigan and they have to learn about Midwestern plant ecology that they'll never use. And most importantly, as I think we all know, graduate students learn more from other graduate students than they ever learn from the professors, and they carry that network for the next 40 years. So that led me, I tried repeatedly to get USAID to say, instead of just sending, we're going to fund 10 park managers from Guatemala, this is a real world example, to come to universities in the US, but they insist on spreading out the 10 universities, so they don't get that networking. And I repeatedly tried to get some interest in this idea of bringing them in as cohorts. Bring in 3 or 5 to the same place, then that university can adjust its curricula so that they're giving something that's more relevant with one student. You can't really do that. But I didn't have much luck until I got really lucky, and that's with the Wallace Research Foundation. And as usual, it's serendipitous. Linda Wallace is one of the, of course, trustees for this foundation, and she was an undergraduate in our program, and an advisee, and she went out and worked for the Desert Museum in a few places, and called me up one day, 10 years later, and said, my board says I need to have a good idea for a project. Do you have any good ideas for conservation?
No.
Not much. And so, yeah, I said, let's fund 3 students from developing countries. And we focused it on, to start out with, on Latin America so that we get the regional networking. And once it got going with Mexico, it's pretty much emphasized Mexico, although we've had other Latin American students funded through it. And the cool thing is that these students are so good. She funded, I guess it was initially 2, just basic stipends for 2 or 3 students simultaneously. But the students that came were so good, they immediately ended up getting funds from other sources. So for that funding, we were able to support more like 6 students. And that just has continued on, and that's the evolution. Yeah.
And then an institution gets a reputation for that, and people send you.
And that's it. Yeah. Initially we were kind of where we're going to get the right students, but then the word gets out, and I mean, it's been going long enough that the students are back now. It's kind of, in terms of marine conservation in the Gulf, it's a little bit inbred.
Yeah.
Someone asked me if Hernan Cortez was one of my students.
As long as we're talking about network things, and we talk about the student and the academic part, I've had a little dabbling with NGOs, and Wendy way more than a little, but you might talk about the challenges and opportunities with working with these organizations and what an academic brings to that in all kinds of ways.
Well, you have to, it takes a lot of time. You have to enjoy what you're doing there. So I think I've been really lucky with being selected on NGOs. The Desert Museum I always enjoyed and believed in, and so wanted to put work in there, and the Southwest Parks Association. I think it was mainly. Now that one is not a typical board, as you know. That's a very academic board. So, but the Desert Museum is more typical, where most of the people on the board have a zillion times more money than I'll ever have, and they're conservative politically, but they're all bound together by wanting to do something good for society. So I find it very satisfying.
How about Sado?
And Sado's unique amongst boards because they have two boards, Mexican and a U.S. board. I have not been on their board, so I don't have any direct experience, except that I'm only 30 years now, so they've survived. That's pretty good. I have one other board that's kind of a fun one for me too. I've worked a lot on integrating conservation into urban planning, as with Saguaro Park and all the Tucson Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan stuff. So I got involved early on in a terrible place called Carmel, California. It's a really beautiful area. And there was a development project there, a group of developers in the early 90s, two developers really, two Stanford grads that reassembled a 20,000 acre ranch in Carmel Valley. And they realized that there was no way they were going to be able to do the typical subdivision scenario. I mean, this place is, both of you have probably seen that area. It's pretty nice. So I got involved because I worked with some urban planning connections, just as an advisor to them, but not due to me, but really due to the vision of the principal partner. They came up with a development plan. Since they knew they couldn't get through the environmental politics of Carmel Valley with a typical thing, they came up with, for 20,000 acres, 300 home sites. And 90% of the land given to the Santa Lucia Conservancy. They created a conservancy, a nonprofit, and there's what's always missing in these kinds of scenarios is the money, right? To run the conservancy. $25 million endowment. And then it's hard to figure out how you can work that 300 homes and come up and give up 90% of the land and all of this. But they're so close. Well, first of all, it was the most exclusive housing site you could imagine. And their timing was such, they went through the usual paddles in trying to get approvals for all the permits and things. Just about to go bankrupt like most developers up and down. And then it was mid-1990s, and they're not far from Silicon Valley. So they were initially marketing to people like Robert Redford and things like that. They just fired their marketing staff because all these young people with fat kids, they never even envisioned that they would have anybody but wealthy retired people. And the Silicon Valley guys came down and put down $2 million for a lot and bought their buddy and bought two more. So that project has been up and going now, and I am the chair of that board, which is really an interesting window.
Different world.
Yeah. And so we have a staff of with that endowment. We don't have to raise money. We will be raising money, but we employ an executive director. We stole the state director of TNC from Texas. And two biologists and an administrator, and then contract environmental educators. So that's a kind of fun,
Yeah,
and very different example of a conservation program. Very controversial because it is rightly vulnerable to criticism that it's conservation for the rich.
Right.
It is not open to the public, but over 50% of our board has to be totally independent of any financial interest, of course, to qualify. And we've got really passionate, high-profile kind of conservationists on our board, and that's what we're always pushing for: is how do we, besides, the fact that we've locked up this biodiversity, how do we make some benefits to society? So we've worked with Luther quite a bit on that, in trying to get this community stewardship organization network, another network of partnerships between conservation organizations and developers to communicate with each other and reinforce. So we work on that. We hire the environmental educators. They take local kids out and use the place for environmental education. And there's a lot of other things that we haven't got to yet. Our full endowment really only happened about 2 years ago, so we're still in the process. But my vision would be a lot more university research out there. I mean, what a laboratory. You can leave your equipment. There's security all over the place, and these homeowners would guard it for you. You can put $1 million out there and just leave it in terms of equipment, because there's no risk somebody's going to steal it. And there's highest density of mountain lions in North America out there. Just beautiful.
Yeah, it sounds wonderful. Yeah. We have had this conversation, which we're now thinking about overweaving, between individuals who have a love of the desert and of where the desert meets the sea, and organizations and institutions, and non-governmental organizations are one part of that. Government institutions are another. And the need for a continuing institutionalization of this stuff. So the third part is putting stuff in reserves and how important that is, and whether or not getting things locked away with a designation on it. And we talked to Bill Broyles, and that's been very much part of his life. But when I talked to Ezekiel Escura, he simply said, well, at bottom it's the people. And then we're back to, and he talks about his mentor and his students, and having met Gary when he was a graduate student, along with Susan Anderson, and it's those kinds of things. How do you, whether or not you've thought about it much before, kind of put those things together in your head, and do you think there's one thing that's essential and the other things follow, or how do you think about that?
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to answer the question directly, but I've always felt that our ecological knowledge is up about here, but our ability to relate as ecologists to the social system at large is way down here. I mean, we actually have a socialization process that if you're interested in biology, that's already sorted out for people that probably don't really like social science. Sometimes don't even like people. And we do that over and over, and then we get them into graduate school. We've already done that screening. And then in our traditional university systems, you got to do a dissertation, so it's got to be narrow rather than broad. Because if you try to do multidisciplinary stuff, you're not an expert on anything. So a lot of stuff kind of are barriers to that. So I think that's one of the keys is my scam has been to be willing to step out. So I really only have credentials in ecology, biology, but I've always been willing and interested in, and I've been pretty successful at exploiting people like Helen to kind of provide the expertise that we don't have. Your replacement Helen has been Adela Shager, who has been on almost every committee now, these students. And as with you, she works them hard, very hard, and but will do anything because they're good and they work hard.
Right,
So,
right. No, I think Adela's going to have a brilliant career.
yeah, she's just inspired the last few students.
Yeah, really a professional person.
Yeah.
But again, it's that mentoring thing from
It's-
Lynn Ostrom and then for other people at the university who've helped her
That's right.
on her way.
In the Gulf, it sounds like one of the driving forces is the people, though not necessarily institutionalizing a fishing regime per se or regulating per se. At least maybe I'm interpreting wrong, but Helen's point of, we did the Pinacate in the Upper Gulf Biosphere Reserve, which kicked off a whole set of processes, but they ultimately involve people. And you're even down at the fisherman to fisherman level.
Right.
Could you have done that without the biosphere as an institution? Could you do any of this, or does that have to be there? Can we conceive of a life without it?
The sustainable fisheries, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it would have happened independently. I mean, the reality is the Gulf of California is one of the most productive marine systems in the world. It's just remarkably productive for all of the inherent natural reasons. And it is probably the most productive body of water that's highly productive and under the control of one country.
Mm-hmm.
So unlike the rest of marine systems where you've got the problem of open access and people coming from anywhere to exploit the resources, the Gulf of California really is fairly well locked up. Not completely. I mean, there are buyers that come in and cut deals, and
Well, you've got U.S. water issues that are impacted, so you've got
that's a
Colorado
huge
River.
issue.
definite financial.
That's a huge issue. But again, that would be there whether or not the biosphere
Right.
thing.
But what would have motivated then? What would have motivated the fishery or the sustainable fishery? Would just a love of somebody's.
One of the things I've learned with just in developing countries anywhere, when you're dealing with subsistence economies, subsistence people, I remember this wonderful student I had from Nepal, who was a graduate student seminar, and the Americans were saying, we need to teach these people conservation. And Uday just shook his head and said, no, they just need the option to implement it. Anybody that lives off the land, agriculturally, or lives off the oceans, they know more about it and they want to do it. It's really the economic reality that, especially in the case of the marine systems where they don't get the political support because they're dispersed and small, unlike industrial fishers, for example. So they don't have any political, the governments don't notice them even though they produce more of Mexico's product than the industrial fishers do. Substantially more, and employ thousands and thousands of people. It's just a day-to-day existence, and they want sustainable programs, except that the problem of open access and no enforcement of anything by the government just gives them no incentive to do it, and no choice.
Prisoner's dilemma.
It's exactly,
Mm-hmm.
and we had this. One of the students, Richard Cudney, worked closely with the fishermen through SADO, and they got the fishermen involved in setting aside these islands that were very important for production of one fishery. And the local fishermen, partly because they were divers, so it wasn't as open access as net fishermen and pole fishermen, because there's equipment and skills that keep people out. So the diving fishermen, though, were a small clique. They got together and agreed not agreed, they decided to, I should say. It's their initiative to set aside this island area for years to and see what happened. And Richard helped them monitor the response of rock scallops, was the species. And because of the highly productive waters, the response was beyond anybody's dream. These things grew much faster. I mean, many of these marine species we really don't know much about, and so they recovered so quickly. The fishermen really became true believers, except one of them had a cousin or something from Keno Bay that heard that there was all these scallops. Oh, and they'd already got their own sustainable plan that they were going to harvest this end of the island this year and the other end the next year and back and forth. Sustainable example, except that somebody from another village fishing community heard about all those scallops and they showed up, and the minute their boats were spotted out there, the local Penasco guy says, "That's it," and they went out and just harvested everything. So, it's just that lack of any kind of governmental support is the huge thing, and we're starting to see some very significant awakenings to that. But without it, people will be people, and it's just the same as non-documented people living here. They're only behaving the way you and I would behave if we had the same circumstances.
You know, when you talked earlier about establishing and working with Mexican NGOs, and there's quite a list of them, do you see any differences in NGOs on two sides of the border?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we have a very long tradition of volunteerism. It's kind of a prestigious thing to do. It's part of your life. If you've been successful, you get on a board for the Desert Museum and help for a little while. I don't think that tradition is there. I'd love to see a study of this, but when I've talked to students about this very question, it's we really do have in our culture this volunteerism tradition. In fact, Irv Zuby and I, years ago, got this grant to take park managers from all over the world, with 24 different countries, and we toured various parks and public land areas.
You guys came to Oregon Pipe.
Yeah.
You came with
okay, now we're getting.
You came with a group from.
They were from all over the world.
Yeah, but these guys were.
Okay. Anyway.
Mongolia. These guys came from Mongolia, and we introduced them to the Tono Oram that we were working with, and they had shared words. Oh my! It was amazing. Yeah. We were sitting there sharing. Yeah.
Shared words and I mean stuff I really don't understand, but I've seen it as shared chemistry. I don't know what.
Yeah. Well, these guys, it was amazing. They looked like each other.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Anyway.
But anyway, we did this. We started with a week of seminars here on campus, and then we toured, and it was put together by the Park Service International Affairs program. So it was a kind of a red carpet deal for park managers from all the arid regions of this and semi-arid regions of the world. But at the end of that course, it was just a wonderful experience. I went around individually and talked to these guys one by one and just said what worked and what didn't work. And they said one thing that I really remember was we really liked it, lots of good examples, but two things they said. One, you showed us so many examples. Like every national park has volunteers that are out in the park ground, campgrounds, volunteer docents doing educational programs. And all this stuff, that just doesn't even make sense to us. Okay, I believe it's happening here, they would say, but it just doesn't happen. And then the other thing that they basically accused us of lying about was you set up these panels where you have someone from Saguaro National Park, the superintendent for Saguaro, on a panel with the district ranger for the National Forest Service, with the Pima County Parks and Recreation people, standing up talking about how they cooperate and collaborate. And they basically said that was bullshit. That cannot ever happen. And it's a luxury we have of stability. You know, these people's jobs don't change every time there's a new election. They can collaborate. So.
Well, it's sort of dependent on personnel, but yesterday we were talking about what a difference it was for the ISDA when the personnel changed,
But we also have heard that, for example, in Mexico with the secession, and you wipe it out from top to bottom, not just the first cadre, the lack of civil service means you start over. And so again, one of the questions I would have with you, you're training individuals, largely from Latin America or Mexico, with that history of wholesale change up and down. Ezekiel has been able to kind of dip in with an administration, then dip back out, and then of course his cadre in the next cycle comes back in. Have you seen that with your students? Is it early or too late to tell whether they'll be able to penetrate those different?
Well, it is a huge problem. Most of these students are working in nonprofit organizations for that very reason.
So they've got longevity and the cycle is not affecting them.
They're going to lose their careers every 6 years.
So the prospect for nonprofits in Mexico is pretty positive, at least.
Actually, I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but they fill a niche for
stability,
leadership stability that I really hadn't thought about before, because that doesn't exist in the government. And even Ezekiel, he's got a stable base in the United States. Yeah. He can dance back and forth.
Yeah.
If you were, I don't know his career history, but it would be very difficult to survive through several different administrative
He hasn't been able to, because he's been in, when the Pinacate in the Upper Gulf, he was in under Colosio, and then he was out in San Diego working with whatever that is.
A museum.
That's right.
And then he dipped back in, and
so that's how he's adapted to it.
But
so,
he's an Argentinian to begin with, so. And he's got this academic credential, which has allowed him now to be in the University of California.
Yeah.
But so if we talk about the importance of individuals, and then we have a structure in an area that for us in the U.S. is so essential to have some maintenance of, as you said, stability. So NGOs are filling that gap.
That's an interesting thought, because in our system, they're not nearly as stable as our government people. It's just the opposite.
Precisely.
If you have a Forest Service career or Park Service, and
it's government to government, and there's all kinds of opportunity.
Yeah.
So it's just the opposite. I hadn't thought about it in those terms. It's we're dealing with conservation of biodiversity, which is by definition very long term and it really doesn't work if you don't have that ability to have a long-term institutional mission that is longer than you or me or anybody, like the Park Service does, our Park Service. If you're going to change the people in charge every 6 years, everything, the biosphere could be gone.
Well, do you think that's another reason that people's long-term commitment to the desert or to the Upper Gulf is so important? I think about yourself and Bill Broyles, long-term interest. Ezekiel, long-term interest in this. And perhaps it takes that sort of longer view to be engaged in something like biodiversity conservation.
Well, I know I can only speak for myself on that, but I started my college at Berkeley with a scholarship in business administration, because my father was a businessman, it took me about a year and a half. It took me accounting and economics, basically. And then I noticed that the only thing I was ever thinking about were the biology-related classes. And so I made the big switch and told my parents. And, I still remember the line was, well, we knew you'd have to, but how will you ever make a living? But,
well, they should look around.
yeah. But so I think for myself, and I'm sure the other people you're mentioning, that's something that's just, we all have what we can contribute and care about, and that's just what I do. Mm-hmm. But it's as a child.
Good. Go ahead with your question. Okay. Well, the place I was going to go next is for a long-term observer. Then we've got various pictures of where we are right now and sort of the future. And one person described it as two worlds. We have this chatter about our dreadful relationship with Mexico and the violence and the drugs and the xenophobia and this sort of bad stuff. And then and then we have this other world of continuing struggle to set aside reserves, to work with people to protect things, to
jointly allocate water.
Yes, to foster the development of students and non-governmental organizations. And they say, well, the politics comes and goes, but this effort is sustained. Then we have others, and important others, who say things are just going to hell in a handbasket. This feels hardwired. I know about past changes, but these are permanent. This wall is permanent. And the structure is there, and the laws are there, and this is really broken, and I have no hope.
Bad.
And it's really bad. That's what we came home so discouraged. So it was very nice then to bring the next day who said, look at all this we've accomplished. Where are you on that continuum?
Naive optimist. How can you be in conservation if you really start to look at the environmental issues we're faced with? It's just, I lose my appetite and get sick if I think about it. So I don't. I try to contribute a little bit here, and know that other people are doing a little bit, and fortunately you see a few successes. But certainly if you step out and take the 100-year retro view, we're not doing too well. So.
I wonder just about the Upper Gulf. Do you think things are better than they were when you got involved in it? Not for you. I'm not suggesting that you claim credit for it, but just are things better?
They are better than they would have been.
Good.
Had there not been there's a big awakening of Mexican environmentalist conservationists, and that's the most exciting thing, is there is a large cadre of really young people with lots of idealism, lots of enthusiasm, and they are, one thing Mexicans are is passionate about their patrimony. They are proud of their country and proud of their heritage. They're going to have to deal with this every 6 years, changes in politics and so on, but they're the best ones out there to do it. So, I think it's, they're just compared with even 15 years ago, there's a lot of people making their living in conservation in Mexico now.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Who might we talk to, do you think, that would reflect this? We're a little bit short on Mexicans we're interviewing. Would you say that?
Hinojosa was one. Osville?
Osville?
Mm-hmm.
Osville. Osville would be good. He's, I don't know that he thinks, he loves birds. He's more the basic biologist and scientist.
Right.
But he's doing the national thinking about
but he is
this.
involved, and he's a brilliant guy.
Are there others? Could we get a hold of a couple of your graduate students?
Absolutely.
Are they here or down there, or do you have them place-based?
They're down there. The best one would be Luis Borillon. It might of these former students. Luis was the one of the original founders of COBE. He's a very he's intense in his conservation passion.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a guy that grew up with fishermen. He told me one story about grabbing their bag of lobsters and throwing it in the water. They were illegally taken. He's surrounded by fishermen. You know, I didn't think that was necessarily good for long-term longevity, but now he is directing the kind of he's directing the Yucatan part of COBE. So they have an office in Yucatan. But he's the person that goes to Mexico City to deal with the politicos in Mexico City. And he's the longest, or one of the longest ones that's been around. So
Anybody who's working in the Gulf we might talk to?
He was in the Gulf.
he was in the Gulf forever, and his organization.
And we might be able to Skype him, huh?
Oh, absolutely.
Maybe you can send me.
Can you introduce Helen?
That
would be great.
That would be great. That would
Make
be
an introduction
really
to
wonderful.
us.
If you just say that we're good guys. We're the white hats.
I would be happy to do that. He was actually one of the first of this Mexican mafia.
Great.
And he was floundering around.
Eco mafia.
Eco mafia, yes.
Don't say mafia. That's not very good. Political commentary.
Good point. Let's leave mafia.
Eco mafia.
I used to say that lightly, but I better shut up on that.
Yeah.
But he was actually the first PhD, and he was floundering around, as often happens in ecology and evolutionary biology, looking for, but wanting to do applied ecology, conservation, and fell in my lap.
When was that? Because his name sounds really familiar.
He was a long-term PhD.
Was he up? When was he up here with you? Was it in the 90s when I was banging around with Luther and Sonoran? I met him.
Good. Well,
He very well may remember me. So use my name.
Good.
Because he very well may remember me.
So I'm confused. Are you Wendy or Gwynn?
Wendy, and my nickname's Gwynn. And then I got married, so it's Benner. So I know, sorry.
It is confusing, and she's given the family permission to always call her Wendy, but because she often is called Gwynn by other professionals.
Whatever.
That's all right.
Yeah, you probably met Luis.
I'm sure I did. The name is very familiar. I'm sure he knows me.
But he for big picture, he's really good.
That sounds perfect. Actually, it just sounds very helpful to us.
And we Skype.
Yeah.
He's very Skypeable.
Good.
Great. Well, where are we on our list of questions? Have we done it?
Well, one thing I'm wondering is, what would I see you as being very transborder in terms of not only your work, but your passion and sense of place. What do you think the characteristics are? We've talked about the importance of an individual. What do you think the characteristics are of a person that can really weave in this area? What makes that then work?
Well, it's not the typical academic, I can tell you that. Okay. Because there's a lot of investment of energy that doesn't produce academic scholarship.
Publishing, yep.
But fortunately, again, we work for the School of Natural Resources. It's part of your job, and once you make the initial hurdle, they let you do it.
Being in agriculture is an advantage from that perspective.
I do. I do believe that the fact that agriculture is applied biological sciences is what it is. I mean, it's multidisciplinary in every way, just as conservation is, but it's respectable to do conservation work. I mean, that one of the classic quotes from one of our good colleagues in ecology and evolutionary biology, who was and is one of the greatest professors they ever had, but he dabbled too much in hobby science.
Oh, what an insult, hobby science.
Which was, he did a lot of work, very significant work on conservation of biodiversity.
It's terrible.
And when he was up for full professor.
That's terrible.
Yeah.
So characteristics that you've described of your students as well are bilinguality, right? Is that essential?
Yeah,
you
which,
that?
I am not truly bilingual.
Cultural sensitivity, or at least some acceptance or understanding of that. Do you see that in your students? You're describing them as being successful. So I'm wondering, what are the characteristics that are making them successful in this international milieu of, even in a climate of fear and xenophobia and
that's a hard
passion,
question.
Motivation,
well,
commitment,
certainly the passion and commitment.
You said the
and
vision.
again, that kind of socialization filtering process, their willingness to come to the U.S., for example, and ability to make it through all the hurdles that takes, already has selected for somebody that's willing to struggle with a second language resources. Because we all know you can't just be a biologist or an economist or a political scientist. You need all over it, across those barriers. I think probably it's a personality trait that selects for me. You can't take.
Right.
It's like taking a fly fishing purist, a type of personality that wants to tie his own flies and do all that, and can you teach him to enjoy bait fishing? It just isn't going to happen. I mean, I don't know. That's a good example.
No, it is a good example.
I think we need to continually. This is a question that comes up in natural resources all the time. How do we get people to cross these barriers and be more multidisciplinary? Because that's the nature of the issue.
Well, the system isn't set up to support that, as you said. Publications are difficult when you're doing a multidisciplinary. The funding isn't really, the PhD isn't.
Academia selects for the type of personality that wants to be the world's expert on this.
Yeah.
And if you're the other type, your name doesn't become broadcast as broadly.
So how did U of A then, at UC Davis, we're a land-grant institution with an amazing extension history, and so all of this external applied science is very much welcome. The funding for the school in agriculture and community development, we have that system. But why U of A?
Good question.
Well, we are a land-grant ag college as well.
So do you have an extension history?
Oh,
yeah.
The entire state extension network is administered out of this College of Agriculture.
That basis.
I also think it's absence of University of California bureaucracy, because in some sense, Arizona is a much more cowboy kind of culture. If you're entrepreneurial and successful at it, they give you a longer string, particularly if you've gotten through the
opposed to a shorter one.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, no, I have, as you have, enjoyed a lot. I mean, it's been a self-directed career.
Exactly. We made up our jobs.
Yeah. As we went.
Yeah. Is that changing under financial constraints now, or what's the future going to look like?
Oh, it's changing dramatically. I hope it's just short term, but the push for the premium for counting how much indirect cost revenue you generate through your grants is commanding everything in the university. And so most of these grants I get come from like Packard Foundation. It's like up to $5 or $6 million, something like that. But they specify they only pay 15%.
Right.
And no vice president even notices those kinds of grants, because someone getting the same amount, well, I mean, in social sciences, my God, you guys have been dealing with this
Forever.
but it's really ramped up where it's hitting even, you know, the people that are in applied science fields that are fairly easy to get problem-solving grants from agencies or from wherever, and we were always able to negotiate with the university to say, look, this is beneficial because we're supporting students or whatever. Get reduced indirect. Every penny now we have to write special memos for.
Yeah, and that's very unlikely. And just as an aside, that would have never been possible at the University of California anyway, because they have these rules, and they're not very good about exceptions to those. Which makes it really
Yeah, so far they've been okay with the exceptions.
right.
Because we have good reasons